The seventh homeless shelter slammed its doors on James as the blizzard consumed Denver, leaving the wounded veteran to freeze alone in the streets. Hours later, two horses screaming in chains would force him to choose between dying in the snow or fighting for one last mission. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The wind howled through the streets of Denver like a beast unleashed, carrying with it sheets of snow that transformed the city into a white wasteland. The blizzard had arrived without mercy, catching even the most prepared residents off guard. Traffic lights swayed dangerously on their cables. Cars abandoned on highways sat buried under growing drifts, and the few souls still on the streets hurried toward whatever shelter they could find. But for James Mitchell, a man whose body bore the scars of war and whose heart carried wounds far deeper, there was no shelter waiting. There was only the cold, the snow, and the weight of a world that seemed to have forgotten him. James limped through the storm, his military-issued jacket doing little to protect him from the biting wind that cut through the fabric like knives. His left leg, injured in an explosion in Kandahar 3 years ago, throbbed with each step, sending sharp pains up his spine. The doctors had told him he was lucky to keep the leg, that many others in his position would have lost it entirely. But James didn't feel lucky. He felt abandoned, cast aside like a broken tool that had served its purpose and was no longer needed. The medals in his backpack meant nothing now. They couldn't buy him a warm meal or a place to sleep, and they certainly couldn't erase the nightmares that haunted him every night. Earlier that day, James had tried his 7th shelter in 2 weeks. He'd stood in line for over an hour, his legs screaming in protest, his hands shaking from the cold. When he finally reached the front desk, a tired woman with sympathetic eyes had looked at him with the same expression he'd seen 6 times before. Full. "We're completely full. Try Sacred Heart on 15th Street. They might have room." But James had already been to Sacred Heart. He'd been turned away there 2 days ago, just like he'd been turned away from every other place that was supposed to help veterans like him. The shelters were overwhelmed, she'd explained, her voice apologetic but firm. The blizzard had brought everyone inside, and there simply wasn't enough space for everyone who needed it. James remembered walking out of that building, feeling the hope drain from his body like water through his fingers. He'd served his country for 8 years, survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, watched brothers die in his arms, and carried their memories home in a mind that never stopped replaying the worst moments. And now, when he needed help, when he was at his most vulnerable, there was nowhere for him to go. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought to protect the freedom and safety of millions, but he couldn't secure even the most basic shelter for himself. As darkness fell and the storm intensified, James found himself on the outskirts of the city, where the buildings gave way to open fields and scattered properties. The wind here was even stronger, unobstructed by tall structures, and the snow fell so thick that he could barely see 10 feet in front of him. His body was shutting down. He could feel it. The cold was seeping into his bones, making his movements slower, his thoughts foggier. He knew the signs of hypothermia from his military training, knew that once the shivering stopped, once the drowsiness set in, it was only a matter of time. Part of him wanted to simply lie down in the snow and let it all end. What did he have to live for anyway? No family that wanted to see him, no job that would hire him, no home to return to. Just an endless cycle of rejection and survival. But then, through the howling wind and swirling snow, James heard something that made him stop. It was faint at first, almost lost in the chaos of the storm, but unmistakable once he focused on it. The sound of horses. Not the comfortable nickering of animals safe in a warm barn, but desperate, frightened cries that cut through the night with an urgency that resonated deep in James's chest. Despite his exhaustion, despite the pain in his leg and the numbness spreading through his fingers, something inside him responded to those cries. They were sounds of suffering, of beings in distress, and even in his broken state, James couldn't ignore them. He changed direction, following the sounds through the blizzard. Each step was agony, his injured leg barely supporting his weight. But he pushed forward. The veteran in him, the part that had been trained to respond to calls for help, to never leave anyone behind, drove him on even as his body begged him to stop. The cries grew louder, more desperate, and James could make out now that there were two distinct voices. Two animals, somewhere ahead in the darkness, calling out for help that might never come. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through knee-deep snow, James saw them. Two horses, one as black as midnight, and the other a pale gray that almost blended with the snow, stood chained to a fence post in an empty field. There was no barn nearby, no shelter of any kind, just an old wooden fence that looked like it had been forgotten years ago. The chains that bound them were heavy and cruel, allowing only a few feet of movement, not nearly enough for the animals to seek shelter from the storm. They were covered in snow, their bodies shaking violently from the cold, and their eyes, wide with fear and confusion, reflected the same desperation James had felt all day. Who would do this, James thought, staring at the animals in disbelief. What kind of person would chain horses outside in a blizzard and leave them to die? The anger that flared in his chest was the first real emotion he'd felt in weeks that wasn't despair or hopelessness. It was pure, righteous fury at the cruelty of it, at the senseless suffering inflicted on these innocent creatures. They hadn't asked for this. They hadn't done anything to deserve it. Just like the civilians he'd tried to protect in Afghanistan. Just like the children whose villages had been caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand, these horses were victims of circumstances beyond their control. James approached slowly, not wanting to frighten them further. The black horse, despite its terror, watched him with an intelligence that surprised him. Its ears swiveled forward, tracking his movements, assessing whether he was another threat or possibly something different. The gray horse, slightly smaller and perhaps younger, pressed close to its companion, seeking whatever comfort it could find. As James drew nearer, he could see the full extent of their situation. The chains were padlocked, designed to prevent theft, but now serving as death sentences. Ice had formed on the metal, freezing the links together and probably burning the horse's skin where it touched. Their water trough was frozen solid, and there was no food visible anywhere. "Easy now," James whispered, his voice rough from disuse and the cold. "I'm not going to hurt you, I promise." The black horse snorted, its breath forming clouds in the frigid air, but it didn't shy away as James extended his hand. He could feel the animal trembling, could see the fear in its eyes, but there was something else there too. A spark of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the recognition that this human was different from the one who had left them here to die. James stood in the blizzard, staring at the chains that bound the two horses, his mind racing despite the cold that was slowly shutting down his body. He had no tools, no bolt cutters, no way to break the heavy padlocks that secured the animals to the fence post. His fingers were so numb he could barely feel them anymore, and the simple act of gripping the chain sent shooting pains through his hands. But giving up wasn't an option. Not for these horses, and maybe, he realized, not for himself either. For the first time in months, James had found something that needed him, something that depended on his actions for survival. It was a purpose, however small, however temporary, and it was more than he'd had in a very long time. The black horse continued to watch him with those intelligent eyes, and James found himself talking to it, the way he used to talk to his squad mates during long nights on patrol. "I know you're scared. I'm scared too. But we're going to figure this out, okay? I'm not leaving you here, I promise you that." The words felt strange coming out of his mouth, rusty from weeks of silence, but they also felt necessary. The horse seemed to calm slightly at the sound of his voice, its ears no longer flat against its head, and James took that as a good sign. He examined the fence post more closely, running his hands along the wood despite the pain in his frozen fingers. The post was old, very old, and as he pushed against it, he felt it shift slightly in the ground. Years of weather had rotted the base, weakening its foundation. James's military training kicked in, assessing the situation with the same tactical mind he'd used in combat. The post was the weak point. If he could topple it, the chains would come free and the horses could move to find shelter. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was the only one he had. James positioned himself against the post, using his good leg for leverage and preparing to push with everything he had left. The injured leg protested immediately, sending waves of agony through his body that made his vision blur, but he gritted his teeth and ignored it. He'd learned to live with pain. It was an old companion now, as familiar as his own reflection. On 3, he told himself, then began to count. 1, 2, 3. He threw his weight against the post, pushing with every ounce of strength remaining in his battered body. The post groaned but didn't give. James fell back into the snow, gasping for breath, his legs screaming in protest. The horses watched him, their eyes reflecting both his struggle and their own desperation. The gray horse whinnied softly, a sound that seemed to carry both encouragement and fear. James lay there for a moment, staring up at the sky where snow continued to fall in endless sheets. It would be so easy to just stay here, to let the cold take him while he watched the snowflakes dance above. But then he heard the horses shift, heard their chains rattle, and he knew he couldn't quit. Not yet. With tremendous effort, James pulled himself back to his feet. His entire body shook, whether from cold or exhaustion or both, he couldn't tell anymore. But he positioned himself against the post again, this time adjusting his angle, using techniques he'd learned in basic training for breaking down doors and overcoming obstacles. He thought about all the times he'd pushed through pain and fear in combat, all the moments when giving up would have meant death for himself and his brothers. This was no different. These horses were depending on him, and he would not fail them. James pushed again, throwing everything he had into the effort. This time he felt the post shift more significantly, felt the rotted wood beginning to splinter at its base. The black horse seemed to sense what he was trying to do and stepped back as far as the chain would allow, pulling at the post from its side. It was almost as if the animal understood, as if it was trying to help. James pushed harder, his vision darkening at the edges, his breath coming in ragged gasps that burned his lungs in the frigid air. Just a little more. Just a little more. With a crack that echoed across the empty field despite the howling wind, the post gave way. It toppled into the snow, taking the chains with it, and suddenly the horses were free. Not free of the chains entirely. Those still hung from their halters, dragging behind them in the snow, but free to move, free to seek shelter. The black horse immediately stepped forward, nuzzling James with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such a large creature. The touch was warm against his frozen face, and James felt tears begin to form in his eyes, though they froze almost instantly on his cheeks. "We did it," he whispered, wrapping his arms around the horse's neck for support, as much as affection. "We actually did it." The gray horse approached as well, less cautious now, pressing its nose against James's shoulder. For a moment, the three of them stood together in the storm, sharing warmth and the small victory they'd achieved. But James knew this was only the beginning. They were still exposed to the elements, still in danger of freezing to death. They needed to find real shelter, and they needed to find it quickly. James looked around, squinting through the snow, trying to remember what he'd seen on his way to this field. There had been a barn, hadn't there? Or maybe it was just a shed. His mind was foggy, the cold making it hard to think clearly, but he was almost certain he'd passed some kind of structure about a quarter-mile back. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to save them all. "Come on," he said to the horses, tugging gently on the black one's chain. "We need to move. We need to find somewhere warm." To his amazement, the horses followed him. Despite their fear, despite everything they'd been through, they trusted him enough to walk through the blizzard at his side. The black horse stayed close to his right, almost as if it sensed his injured leg and was offering support. The gray followed just behind, occasionally pressing its nose against James's back as if to urge him forward. They moved slowly through the deep snow, a strange procession of broken souls helping each other survive. Every step was torture for James. His leg had gone beyond pain into a realm of agony that made him want to scream, but he bit down on his lip and kept moving. The horses needed him to be strong. They needed him to lead them to safety. And strangely, he needed them too. Their presence beside him, their trust in him despite being strangers, gave him a reason to keep fighting when his body wanted nothing more than to surrender to the cold. The world had become nothing but white. James could barely see his own hands in front of his face as the blizzard intensified, the wind driving snow into his eyes and mouth with every breath. His sense of direction was completely gone now, lost somewhere in the chaos of the storm. He wasn't even sure if he was heading toward the structure he thought he'd seen or if he was leading the horses deeper into the wilderness where they would all perish together. But stopping wasn't an option. Movement meant warmth, however slight, and it meant hope. The moment they stopped moving would be the moment they gave up, and James had promised these horses he wouldn't abandon them. The black horse pressed closer to his side, and James realized the animal was actually helping to support his weight. Somehow, this creature that had every reason to fear humans after being chained in a blizzard to die had chosen to trust him, to help him even as he tried to help it. The thought brought a lump to James's throat that had nothing to do with the cold. How long had it been since anyone had tried to help him? How long since anyone had seen him as worth saving? The Veterans Affairs Office had sent him paperwork. The shelters had given him apologetic looks. His family had offered prayers from a distance, but no one had actually stood beside him, bearing his weight, refusing to let him fall. His foot caught on something hidden beneath the snow, and James went down hard. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and for a moment he just lay there, his face pressed into the frozen ground, his body screaming at him to just stay down. It would be so easy. The cold didn't hurt as much anymore. In fact, he was starting to feel almost warm, a pleasant numbness spreading through his limbs. Some distant part of his mind recognized this as a bad sign, recognized that his body was beginning to shut down. But that part seemed very far away now, barely relevant. Then he felt it. A warm breath on his neck, followed by gentle pressure as the black horse lowered its head and pushed against his shoulder. The horse didn't give up. It pushed again, more insistently this time, and James heard a sound that was almost like a plea. The gray horse joined in, both animals now nudging him, their warm breath forming clouds in the frigid air as they worked to get him back on his feet. They weren't going to let him quit. These animals, who had every reason to abandon him and seek their own survival, were refusing to leave him behind. "Get up, James." A voice echoed in his mind, but it wasn't his own. It was Sergeant Rodriguez, his squad leader in Afghanistan, the man who had pulled James from a burning vehicle after the IED exploded. Rodriguez had died 2 months later in an ambush, but his words had stayed with James. "Nobody gets left behind. Not on my watch. Not ever." James had carried those words home with him, had clung to them during his darkest moments, and now, with 2 horses refusing to abandon him in a blizzard, he heard them again. With a groan that came from somewhere deep in his soul, James pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. The horses stepped back slightly, giving him room but staying close, their eyes watching him with an intensity that seemed almost human. James grabbed the black horse's mane and used it to pull himself upright. His leg buckled immediately, but the horse braced itself, becoming a living crutch that kept him from falling again. "I'm okay. I'm okay. We keep moving." The words were as much for himself as for the horses. They continued forward into the storm, and James no longer knew if minutes or hours were passing. Time had become meaningless, measured only in steps and breaths in the constant battle against the cold. His mind began to drift, memories flooding back unbidden. He remembered his first deployment, the fear and excitement mixing in his gut as the plane touched down in Kandahar. He remembered the faces of his brothers in arms, young men who had become closer than family in the crucible of war. He remembered Corporal Jenkins, who had loved horses and talked constantly about his family's ranch in Montana, showing everyone pictures of his favorite mare until they all knew her name by heart. Thunder. That was what Jenkins had called her. A black horse with a white star on her forehead and eyes that Jenkins swore could see right into your soul. Jenkins hadn't made it home. None of them had, except James. He was the sole survivor of his squad, the only one who had walked away from that final mission when everything went wrong. The guilt of that survival had eaten at him every day since, had driven him to push away his family, to reject help, to punish himself with isolation and suffering, because how could he deserve comfort when his brothers would never feel anything again? But now, struggling through this blizzard with two horses who refused to give up, James wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. Maybe it was a responsibility. Through the curtain of snow, James saw it, a dark shape looming ahead, angular and solid against the white chaos. The barn. It was real, not a hallucination or a wishful thought. It was actually there. New energy surged through James's exhausted body, adrenaline giving him strength he didn't know he still possessed. Almost there, just a little further. Come on. The horses seemed to sense his renewed hope and quickened their pace, careful not to move faster than James could manage with his injured leg. As they drew closer, James could make out more details. It wasn't a working barn, that much was clear. The paint was peeling, some of the boards were missing, and one of the large doors hung crooked on its hinges. But it had a roof and walls, and right now that was all that mattered. It was shelter. It was survival. It was a chance for all three of them to live through this night. James reached the door and grabbed the handle, his frozen fingers barely able to grip it, but he pulled with everything he had. The door resisted at first, swollen from moisture and disuse, but then it gave way with a groan that sounded almost like relief. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with old hay and abandoned equipment, but it was out of the wind. The temperature inside wasn't warm by any stretch, but compared to the killing cold outside, it felt like paradise. James led the horses inside, and as soon as all three of them were through the doorway, he pushed the door closed against the storm. The sudden absence of wind was shocking. James's ears rang in the relative quiet, broken only by the sound of the horses breathing heavily and the distant howl of the blizzard outside. He sank down against the wall, his leg finally giving out completely, and the horses stood nearby, shaking the snow from their coats. They had made it. Against all odds, through a storm that should have killed them all, they had found shelter. James sat slumped against the barn wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The adrenaline that had carried him through the final push to safety was draining away, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion that made even the simple act of breathing feel like climbing a mountain. His clothes were soaked through, frozen in places where the fabric had stiffened into icy sheets against his skin. He knew he needed to move, needed to do something about his wet clothing before hypothermia claimed him, but his body simply refused to cooperate. Every muscle felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive. The horses stood a few feet away, their sides heaving with their own exhaustion. Steam rose from their bodies in the cold air of the barn, and James could see them trembling. The chains still hung from their halters, trailing on the ground like the remnants of a nightmare they'd escaped, but couldn't quite leave behind. James watched them through half-closed eyes, noting how the black horse kept its body positioned between the gray one and the door, as if still protecting its companion from whatever danger might come through. Even in their own distress, the animals looked after each other. The observation touched something in James, reminded him of how his squad had operated, always watching each other's backs, always putting the team before self. With tremendous effort, James forced himself to stand. His leg nearly buckled again, but he grabbed onto a support beam and held himself upright. He couldn't just sit there and freeze. He needed to assess their situation, needed to make sure they were truly safe. Using the beam for support, he made his way deeper into the barn, looking for anything that might help them survive the night. The building was larger than he'd initially thought, with several stalls lining one wall and what looked like an old tack room in the corner. Hay bales were stacked against the far wall, old and dusty but still dry. James's military training kicked in again, methodically cataloging their resources. The hay could provide insulation and a place to rest. There were some old horse blankets hanging on pegs near the stalls, moth-eaten and musty but still functional. In the tack room, he found a few tools, some rope, and best of all, an old lantern with about half a tank of kerosene still in it. His frozen fingers fumbled with the matches he found next to it, dropping the first two before finally managing to light the third. The lantern flickered to life, casting a warm orange glow throughout the barn that seemed to push back the darkness and cold. The light revealed more details of their shelter. This barn had clearly been abandoned for years. Cobwebs hung from every corner, and small animal droppings littered the floor. But the roof appeared mostly intact, with only a few places where snow had drifted through gaps in the boards. It wasn't the Ritz, James thought with a grim smile, but it was infinitely better than freezing to death in an open field. He'd slept in much worse places during his deployments, though usually those places had come with the benefit of his military gear and fellow soldiers to share body heat. James gathered the horse blankets and brought them to the nearest stall, spreading them out on the hay he'd scattered there. Then he turned his attention to the horses, who had been watching his movements with quiet interest. "Come here, let me look at you properly. Let me look at you." His voice was rough, barely above a whisper, but the black horse responded immediately, walking over with a trust that James still found remarkable. Up close in the lantern light, he could see the animal more clearly. It was a magnificent creature, probably a quarter horse or Mustang mix with intelligent eyes and a strong build, despite the ordeal it had endured. James's hands moved carefully over the horse's body, checking for injuries. There were some abrasions where the chains had rubbed, and the animal was definitely underweight, but overall it seemed to have survived its abandonment without serious harm. The gray horse, emboldened by its companion's acceptance of James, approached as well. This one was younger, James realized, maybe only 3 or 4 years old. It had the gangly look of a horse still growing into its frame, and its eyes held a mixture of fear and curiosity that reminded James of the new recruits he'd trained back in his army days. As he examined both horses, removing the chains as carefully as his numb fingers would allow, James found himself talking to them in a low, steady voice. "You're going to be okay now. I know you've been through hell, but that's over. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. I promise you that." The words were meant to comfort the horses, but James realized they were comforting him too. Making promises to these animals, taking responsibility for their welfare, gave him a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for far too long. Once the chains were removed and tossed into a corner where they could no longer cause harm, James led both horses into the stall he'd prepared. They went willingly, seeming to understand that this human meant them no harm. The black horse immediately lowered its head to investigate the hay, and after a moment's hesitation, began to eat. The gray followed suit, and James felt a profound relief watching them. They were hungry and thirsty, certainly, but they were alive and they were safe. James knew he needed to tend to his own needs as well. His wet clothes were a death sentence if he didn't get them off. With shaking hands, he managed to remove his jacket and outer shirt, hanging them on a nail to dry near the lantern's warmth. His undershirt was damp but not soaked, and he decided to keep it on for whatever warmth it could provide. He wrapped one of the remaining horse blankets around his shoulders, not caring about the musty smell or the fact that it was probably older than he was. The storm continued to rage outside, the wind howling around the barn's walls and finding every crack and gap to whistle through. But inside, in the small circle of lantern light, James felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Safety. Not complete safety. Not the kind that came with locked doors and working heat and the knowledge that tomorrow would be better, but immediate safety. The kind that meant he would survive this night, and so would the horses he'd saved. James settled himself in the corner of the stall, leaning back against the wall with the blanket pulled tight around him. His leg throbbed with a pain that made his eyes water, but he was too exhausted to care much about it. The horses had finished their initial exploration of the hay and now stood quietly nearby. To James's surprise, the black horse walked over and lowered itself to the ground beside him, its large body radiating warmth. The gray horse followed, settling on his other side, and suddenly James found himself sandwiched between two massive animals who had decided he was worth protecting. The warmth from the horses seeped into James's frozen body slowly, like spring thawing winter ice. He could feel their steady breathing, the rise and fall of their massive sides creating a rhythm that was oddly comforting. It reminded him of nights in the barracks surrounded by his brothers, listening to their breathing in the darkness and knowing he wasn't alone. That had been before everything fell apart, before the explosion that took his leg and his future, before the slow descent into a life he no longer recognized as his own. James closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come easily. His mind was too active, replaying the events of the day in an endless loop. Every shelter that had turned him away, the desperate walk through the storm, the moment he'd heard the horses crying out in the darkness, the feeling of the fence post finally giving way. Each memory was sharp and clear, cutting through the fog of exhaustion like a knife. But mixed in with those fresh memories were older ones, harder ones, the kind that usually visited him only in nightmares. He remembered the day he'd come home from Afghanistan, expecting some kind of hero's welcome or at least acknowledgement of what he'd sacrificed. Instead, he'd found a country that had moved on, people who thanked him for his service in the same breath they used to ask if he'd checked the time or commented on the weather. Meaningless words that cost nothing and meant even less. His family had tried at first, his mother especially, but they didn't understand. How could they? They hadn't seen what he'd seen, hadn't held dying friends in their arms, hadn't carried the weight of being the only one who made it home. The Veterans Affairs system had been a maze of paperwork and waiting rooms and appointments that led nowhere. They'd given him a disability rating, some money each month that barely covered rent when he could find a landlord willing to rent to him, and a list of resources he could access if he needed help. But when he actually needed that help, when the nightmares got so bad he couldn't sleep and the pain in his leg made it impossible to work, those resources had evaporated like morning dew. The counselors had waiting lists months long. The job training programs were full. The housing assistants had run out of funding. Sorry, they all said. We're doing the best we can. Try again next month. James had tried. He'd tried so hard that eventually trying became all he did. He'd tried to find work, but his injury made physical labor difficult, and his lack of recent civilian experience made office jobs impossible. He'd tried to maintain friendships, but his friends from before the military had moved on with their lives, and his friends from the military were scattered across the country or dealing with their own demons. He'd tried to stay in his apartment, but when the medical bills from emergency room visits for his leg mounted up, the rent had to go unpaid. He'd tried to stay positive, to believe that things would get better, but hope was an expensive luxury he could no longer afford. The black horse shifted beside him, pressing closer, and James opened his eyes to find the animal watching him in the lantern light. There was something profound in that gaze, a depth of understanding that shouldn't have been possible from a creature that couldn't speak. But James felt seen in that moment, truly seen in a way he hadn't been in years. This horse had been abandoned, left to die in a storm by someone who should have cared for it, and yet it had chosen to trust James, to lie beside him and offer warmth when it could have just saved itself. "You know what it's like, don't you?" James whispered, his hand reaching out to rest on the horse's neck. "You know what it feels like to be thrown away." The horse didn't respond with words, of course, but it leaned into his touch, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The gray horse, not wanting to be left out, pushed its nose against James's shoulder, and he found himself smiling despite everything. Here he was, a broken veteran who'd been rejected by every shelter in the city, finding acceptance from two animals that had every reason to hate humans. The irony wasn't lost on James. He'd spent months feeling worthless, believing that he had nothing left to contribute to the world, that his best days were behind him and all that remained was a slow decline into obscurity. But tonight, in this abandoned barn during the worst blizzard in years, he'd saved 2 lives. He'd found the strength to break through chains and trudge through impossible conditions because these horses needed him. And now they were here, alive and safe, because he hadn't given up on them. Maybe, James thought, that meant something. Maybe it meant he still had value, still had a purpose, even if that purpose was different from what he'd imagined. His thoughts drifted to Corporal Jenkins again, the young soldier who had loved horses so much. Jenkins had talked about getting out of the Army and going back to Montana to work on his family's ranch. He'd described it in such vivid detail that James felt like he'd been there himself. Wide open spaces where horses could run free. Mountains in the distance that turned purple at sunset. Work that was hard but honest, where you could see the results of your labor in healthy animals and productive land. Jenkins had promised to show it to James someday, had said there would always be a place for him there if he wanted it. But Jenkins was gone, buried in Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, and his dream of returning home had died with him. James had attended the funeral, stood at attention while they folded the flag and handed it to Jenkins's mother, a small woman with her son's eyes who had sobbed into her husband's chest while the bugler played taps. James had wanted to tell her about all the times Jenkins had talked about home, about how much he'd loved that ranch and those horses, but the words had stuck in his throat. What comfort could he offer when he was the one who got to live while her son did not? The storm outside intensified, the wind slamming against the barn with such force that the old structure groaned in protest. Snow found its way through the cracks in the walls, creating small drifts in the corners where the lantern light didn't reach. But in the stall, surrounded by hay and old blankets, and 2 horses who had chosen to stay close to him, James felt insulated from the chaos. This small bubble of warmth and safety was its own world, separate from the storm and from the hard reality that waited beyond it. The night stretched on, and James drifted in and out of consciousness, never quite falling into deep sleep, but never fully awake either. Each time his eyes opened, he saw the same scene, the lantern burning low, casting dancing shadows on the barn walls, the horses breathing steadily beside him, their warmth keeping the worst of the cold at bay, the storm continuing its assault outside, relentless and uncaring. In these half-awake moments, James's mind wandered through memories both recent and distant, unable to settle, unable to find peace. He thought about the psychiatric evaluation he'd undergone 6 months ago, required by the VA to assess his mental fitness. The doctor, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a gentle voice, had asked him a series of questions about his experiences in Afghanistan, about how he was adjusting to civilian life, about whether he had thoughts of harming himself or others. James had answered honestly at first, describing the nightmares that woke him screaming, the panic attacks triggered by loud noises, the crushing guilt that made it hard to get out of bed most mornings. But as the questions continued, he'd seen the doctor taking notes, checking boxes, and he'd begun to understand that honesty had consequences. They'd diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury, conditions that came with treatment plans and medication prescriptions and regular follow-up appointments. James had tried to follow the plan, had taken the pills that made him feel disconnected from himself, had attended the group therapy sessions where veterans sat in a circle and shared their stories while a facilitator nodded encouragingly, but the medications had side effects that made his hands shake and his thoughts foggy. The therapy sessions had felt performative, everyone saying what they thought they should say rather than what they actually felt. After 3 months, James had stopped going. He'd stopped taking the pills. He'd stopped pretending that any of it was helping. His family had been disappointed but not surprised. His mother had cried on the phone, telling him he needed to keep trying, that giving up wasn't the answer. His father had been more direct, suggesting that James was being stubborn, that he was throwing away opportunities for help because he wanted to wallow in self-pity. His sister had stopped calling altogether after James had snapped at her during one conversation, telling her she had no idea what she was talking about, that her comfortable life in the suburbs with her husband and 2 kids was so far removed from his reality that her advice was meaningless. He'd apologized later, but the damage was done. The calls from his family had become less frequent, then rare, then almost non-existent. The black horse stirred, lifting its head to look around the barn before settling back down. James watched the animal, envying its ability to simply exist in the moment without the weight of past regrets or future anxieties. Horses didn't lie awake wondering if they could have done things differently, didn't torment themselves with thoughts of what might have been. They survived, adapted, and moved forward. James wished he could do the same, wished he could shed his past like the horses had shed the snow from their coats, but the past clung to him like a second skin, inescapable and suffocating. He remembered the exact moment everything changed, the day that divided his life into before and after. They'd been on a routine patrol through a village outside Kandahar, checking for signs of insurgent activity, talking to locals, trying to win hearts and minds in a place where trust was a rare commodity. Jenkins had been walking point, always eager to prove himself, always volunteering for the most dangerous positions. James had been right behind him, focused on scanning the rooftops for snipers, when Jenkins had stepped on the pressure plate. The explosion had been deafening, a wall of force and fire that had lifted James off his feet and thrown him backward. He'd landed hard, his leg twisted beneath him, his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear the screams he knew must be happening. Through the smoke and dust he'd seen Jenkins, or what was left of him, and something inside James had broken that could never be repaired. The others in the squad, Rodriguez and Martinez and Thompson and Williams, had rushed forward to help. That was when the second IED had detonated. James had watched helplessly as his brothers were torn apart, unable to move because of his own injuries, unable to help, unable to save them. The insurgents had been watching, waiting for the rescue attempt, knowing that soldiers never left their wounded behind. It was a trap, and they'd walked right into it. By the time the medevac arrived, James was the only one still alive, lying in a pool of blood that wasn't entirely his own, surrounded by the bodies of men he'd loved like family. The guilt of surviving when they hadn't was a burden James carried every moment of every day. It colored everything, made joy feel like betrayal, made comfort feel like something he didn't deserve. How could he accept help when his brothers would never receive help again? How could he move forward when they were frozen in time, forever young, forever gone? These questions had no answers, but they haunted him nonetheless, circling in his mind like vultures over carrion. But tonight, with the horses pressed against him, and the storm raging outside, James felt something shift inside him. It was small, barely perceptible, but it was there. A tiny crack in the wall he'd built around himself, letting in a sliver of light. These horses had been abandoned, just as he'd been abandoned. They'd faced death just as he'd faced death. But they hadn't given up. They'd kept fighting, kept surviving, and when someone had finally offered them help, they'd accepted it. They'd trusted, despite having every reason not to. Maybe that was the lesson James needed to learn. Maybe survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. Maybe it was a gift, a second chance, an opportunity to honor those who didn't make it by living a life that mattered. His brothers wouldn't want him to suffer. They'd want him to thrive, to find purpose, to make their sacrifice mean something. Jenkins especially, with his dreams of horses and wide open spaces, would have understood this moment perfectly. He would have seen the poetry in it, a wounded soldier and two abandoned horses finding each other in a blizzard, saving each other when no one else would. Dawn came slowly, the storm refusing to release its grip even as the sun tried to climb above the horizon. The light that filtered through the cracks in the barn walls was gray and weak, barely distinguishing itself from the darkness of night. James woke to find both horses still beside him, their bodies warm and their breathing steady. The lantern had burned out sometime during the night, leaving them in the pale twilight of morning. His body ached in places he didn't know could ache, and his injured leg had stiffened to the point where he wasn't sure he'd be able to stand, but he was alive. They were all alive. The black horse was already awake, its ears swiveling toward the sounds of the storm outside. When it noticed James stirring, it turned its large head toward him, and in that moment, James felt a connection so profound it took his breath away. This animal had saved his life as surely as he'd saved its. If he'd given up during that walk through the blizzard, if he'd lain down in the snow and let the cold take him, they would all be dead now. But they'd pushed each other forward, refused to let each other quit, and somehow they'd made it through the darkest night. James reached out and placed his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the strong pulse beneath the skin. "You need a name. I can't keep calling you the Black Horse." His voice was rough from disuse and the cold, but the horse seemed to appreciate being spoken to. It lowered its head closer to him, allowing James to stroke its face. "Shadow. That's what I'll call you, because you stayed with me through the darkest night." The name felt right, felt earned in a way that few things in James's life had felt recently. The gray horse stirred as well, lifting its head and yawning widely enough that James could see all of its teeth. This one was younger, more skittish, but it had proven itself brave in its own way, following Shadow's lead and trusting James when trust must have seemed impossible. "And you," James said, turning his attention to the gray horse. "Your hope. Because finding you both gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." The gray horse, now christened Hope, blinked at him with those large liquid eyes, and James felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. Getting to his feet was an ordeal that took several minutes and required using Shadow's body for support. His leg was worse than it had been the night before, swollen and hot to the touch even through his pants. James knew he needed medical attention, knew that pushing it the way he had could have caused permanent damage, but that was a problem for later. Right now, he needed to assess their situation and figure out how they were going to survive another day. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and they had no food and no water beyond what they could melt from snow. James limped around the barn, taking better stock of their resources in the morning light. The hay he'd found the night before was old but still edible for the horses, enough to last them a few days if rationed carefully. There were some old grain sacks in the tack room that still had a few pounds of feed in them, probably left behind when the barn was abandoned. For himself, James had the 2 protein bars he'd been saving in his backpack, emergency rations that he'd hoarded through weeks of homelessness. It wasn't much, but it was something. Water was the bigger concern. The horses would need it, and soon. James found a bucket and went to the barn door, pushing it open just enough to scoop up fresh snow. The wind nearly tore the door from his hands, and the cold that rushed in felt like a physical slap, but he managed to get the bucket filled before forcing the door shut again. Back in the stall, he set the bucket near the dying warmth of his body, hoping his limited heat would be enough to melt at least some of the snow. Shadow and Hope watched his efforts with interest, and James found himself explaining his actions to them as if they were fellow soldiers. We need to stay hydrated. That's rule 1 in survival situations. Doesn't matter how cold it is, dehydration will kill you faster than you think. His words echoed in the empty barn, sounding strange to his own ears. He'd barely spoken to anyone in weeks, had gotten so used to silence that hearing his own voice felt foreign. But the horses seemed to like it, their ears turning toward him whenever he spoke. So he kept talking. Told them about survival training, about the time his squad had been stranded for 3 days waiting for extraction, about the things he'd learned that might keep them alive now. As the morning wore on, James became increasingly aware of how precarious their situation was. The storm wasn't letting up, which meant no one would be out looking for missing animals or homeless veterans. They were completely isolated, cut off from the world, dependent entirely on themselves and the meager resources of this forgotten barn. In his military days, James had been trained for situations like this, had practiced survival skills until they were second nature, but those skills had been learned with the knowledge that rescue was always coming, that there were people watching and waiting to bring him home. Now, there was no one, no extraction team, no support, no safety net. The thought should have terrified him, but instead James felt a strange calm settling over him. He'd been on his own for months now, struggling through each day with no real direction or purpose. But here, in this barn with these horses depending on him, he had clarity. His mission was simple. Keep Shadow and Hope alive, keep himself alive, survive until the storm passed. Everything else, all the complicated emotions and painful memories and uncertain future, could wait. Right now, in this moment, he knew exactly what he needed to do. James divided one of his protein bars into 3 pieces, eating one and saving the other 2 for later. It wasn't nearly enough to satisfy his hunger, but hunger was an old friend by now, easier to ignore than the pain in his leg or the ache in his heart. He made sure the horses had access to the hay and the slowly melting snow water, rationing it carefully so it would last. Then he settled back into the corner of the stall, wrapped in the old horse blanket, and watched Shadow and Hope as they moved around their temporary home. The second day in the barn brought new challenges. The storm had finally begun to weaken, though snow still fell steadily and the wind continued to howl through the cracks in the walls. James's leg had worsened overnight, the swelling now so severe that he could barely put any weight on it. Every movement sent lightning bolts of agony shooting up his spine, and he knew that if he didn't get proper medical treatment soon, he might lose the leg entirely. But leaving the barn wasn't an option. The storm was still too dangerous, and even if he could make it to civilization, he couldn't abandon Shadow and Hope. They were his responsibility now, bound together by circumstance and survival. James spent the morning watching the horses, learning their personalities and quirks. Shadow was clearly the leader, the one who made decisions and watched for danger. The black horse moved with confidence and purpose, checking the barn's perimeter regularly, testing the strength of the walls with gentle pushes of its nose. When Hope would become anxious, ears flattening and eyes rolling, Shadow would step close and touch its muzzle to the younger horse's neck, a gesture of comfort and reassurance. The bond between them was obvious, and James found himself wondering about their history. Had they grown up together? Were they from the same herd? What kind of person would chain such magnificent animals outside to die? Hope was more playful despite everything they'd been through. As the day progressed and the young horse's energy returned with food and rest, it began to explore the barn more thoroughly, nosing into corners and investigating old equipment with the curiosity of youth. At one point, Hope found an old bucket and began tossing it around, creating a clanging noise that made Shadow snort disapprovingly. James laughed, the sound startling him because he couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed. It felt rusty, unused, but also good. Really good. "You're trouble, aren't you?" James called out to Hope, who had abandoned the bucket and was now trying to pull down an old bridle hanging from a peg. The gray horse turned to look at him, and James could swear he saw mischief in those eyes. "Jenkins would have loved you. Always getting into things you shouldn't." The mention of his fallen friend's name brought the familiar ache to James's chest, but this time it was different. Instead of the crushing guilt that usually accompanied thoughts of Jenkins, James felt something closer to bittersweet fondness. Jenkins had loved life, had found joy in small things, had maintained his humor even in the darkest situations. Maybe that was how James should honor his memory, by trying to find those moments of light rather than dwelling in darkness. By afternoon, James's limited supplies were nearly exhausted. He'd eaten the last of his protein bars, giving most of it to the horses despite his own gnawing hunger. The snow water had been replenished throughout the day, but it was clear that they would need a better solution soon. The horses needed proper nutrition, and James needed food desperately. His body was running on empty, consuming itself for energy, and he could feel his strength fading. If the storm didn't break soon, he would have to make a choice. Stay in the barn and slowly starve, or venture out into the weather and risk freezing to death trying to find help. As James sat contemplating this impossible decision, Shadow approached him with an unusual intensity. The black horse pushed its nose against James's chest, then walked toward the barn door and back, then repeated the action. James watched, confused at first, but then understanding dawned. Shadow was trying to tell him something. The horse repeated the pattern twice more, and James pulled himself to his feet, ignoring the screaming protest from his leg. He limped to the door and cracked it open, and what he saw made his heart leap with hope. The snow had stopped. The wind had died down to almost nothing. The storm had finally passed. The world outside was transformed, buried under several feet of snow that gleamed white and pristine under a sky that was beginning to clear. The sun, weak and pale but present, broke through the clouds in places, creating patches of light across the frozen landscape. James stepped out into the snow, sinking nearly to his waist, and took a deep breath of the frigid air. It hurt his lungs, but it was the pain of being alive, of having survived something that should have killed him. Shadow and Hope followed him out, their longer legs allowing them to move through the deep snow more easily than James could manage. For several minutes, the three of them simply stood there, taking in the aftermath of the blizzard. The horses stretched their legs, shaking off the stiffness from being confined in the barn. James scanned the horizon, looking for any sign of civilization, any indication of which direction they should go. He could see nothing but white in every direction, the landscape rendered unrecognizable by the massive snowfall. But in the far distance, perhaps 2 or 3 miles away, he thought he could make out a dark line that might be a road or tree line. It was their best bet. Their only bet, really. James knew the journey would be brutal. His leg would barely support him, and trudging through snow this deep would exhaust what little energy he had left. But staying at the barn meant slow death by starvation. At least attempting to reach civilization gave them a chance. He looked at Shadow and Hope, who stood watching him with those intelligent eyes, and he made his decision. "We're going to walk out of here. All 3 of us. Together. I don't know how far we'll get, but we're going to try." The horses seemed to understand the gravity of the moment. Shadow stepped close to James's right side, the side with the injured leg, and Hope moved to his left. It was the same formation they'd maintained during their desperate flight through the blizzard. and James felt his eyes sting with tears that had nothing to do with the cold. The trek began slowly, each step a monumental effort. James used Shadow's body for support, gripping the horse's mane when his leg threatened to give out completely. The snow was so deep that even the horses struggled at times, their powerful bodies breaking through the crust only to sink into the powder beneath. But they moved forward, driven by necessity and the unspoken bond that had formed between them. James had no idea how long it would take to reach that distant tree line, no idea if help would be there when they arrived. But giving up wasn't an option. Not after surviving the storm, not after finding each other. The sun climbed higher as they struggled through the snow, but its warmth was deceptive. The temperature remained brutally cold, and the exertion required to move through the deep drifts left James gasping for breath. His injured leg had gone beyond pain, into a state of numbness that was almost worse because he couldn't tell how much damage he was doing with each step. He simply had to trust that Shadow would support him when his leg gave out, and trust that he had enough strength left to make it to wherever they were going. Time became meaningless again, measured only in the rhythm of their movement. Step, sink, struggle, step. Shadow's breathing beside him, steady and determined. Hope following behind, occasionally pushing against James's back as if urging him forward. The tree line that had seemed so close from the barn door remained distant, always just out of reach, mocking their efforts. James's vision began to blur at the edges, dark spots dancing in front of his eyes that he recognized as signs of extreme exhaustion and possibly shock. His body was shutting down, using the last reserves of energy it had to keep him moving. Shadow suddenly stopped, nearly causing James to fall. The black horse's ears swiveled forward, focused on something James couldn't yet see or hear. Hope moved up beside them, also alert, also sensing something in the distance. James squinted against the glare of sun on snow, trying to make out what the horses had detected. Then he heard it. A sound so ordinary and yet so miraculous in that moment that James thought he might be hallucinating. The distant rumble of an engine, a vehicle somewhere ahead moving slowly through the snow. "Help!" James tried to shout, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. His throat was raw from breathing the cold air, and his body had no energy left for yelling. He tried again, forcing more air through his vocal cords. "Help! Over here!" This time the sound was louder, more desperate, carrying across the empty white landscape. Shadow seemed to understand what James was trying to do and let out a loud whinny, a sound that echoed far better than James's weak voice. Hope joined in, both horses calling out to whoever was out there, announcing their presence. The engine sound changed, slowed, then stopped. James held his breath, afraid that whoever was driving had decided to turn back, that they'd missed their chance. But then he saw it. A large truck, some kind of utility vehicle with oversized tires and a plow on the front, appearing over a rise in the landscape. It stopped again, and James could make out a figure climbing down from the cab, a person dressed in winter gear waving their arms. The person started moving toward them, struggling through the snow but making better progress than James had managed. As the figure got closer, James could see it was a woman, probably in her 50s, with a weathered face and concerned eyes, visible beneath her winter hat. She reached them, breathing hard from the exertion, and took in the scene with an expression that shifted from confusion to understanding to compassion in the span of seconds. A man barely standing, supported by a horse, all three of them clearly at the end of their endurance. The woman didn't waste time with questions. Instead, she moved to James's other side, taking some of his weight off Shadow, and began helping him toward the truck. "I've got you. Just hold on. We'll get you warmed up." Her voice was firm and kind, the voice of someone used to handling emergencies in rural areas. "My name's Carol. I run the animal rescue about 5 miles from here. Been checking the properties since the storm broke, making sure no one left animals out in this." Looks like I found some. She glanced at Shadow and Hope with an expression that told James she'd seen too many cases of animal neglect and abuse in her work. But she also looked at James with that same compassion, recognizing that he too was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Getting to the truck was an ordeal. James could barely move his legs anymore, and Carol had to practically carry him the final distance. Shadow and Hope followed closely, unwilling to be separated from the man who had saved them. When they reached the truck, Carol helped James into the passenger seat, then opened the back of the vehicle, where there was a large cargo area clearly designed for transporting animals. "Come on, you two. Let's get you loaded up." She spoke gently to the horses, moving slowly and carefully, and to James's amazement, Shadow walked right up to the ramp and climbed in. Hope hesitated only a moment before following. Carol worked quickly once everyone was loaded, starting the truck and cranking the heat as high as it would go. She pulled a thermos from behind her seat and poured something hot into the cup, handing it to James. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold it, but the warmth seeping through the metal was incredible. "Drink. It's just coffee, but it'll help." She threw a blanket over James's shoulders, then put the truck in gear and began the slow drive back toward her rescue facility. James sipped the coffee, feeling the hot liquid burn down his throat and into his stomach, spreading warmth through his core. He wanted to thank Carol, wanted to explain what had happened, wanted to tell her about the chains and the blizzard and how these horses had saved his life as much as he'd saved theirs. But the words wouldn't come. His body, finally feeling safe, finally feeling warm, decided it had endured enough. The darkness at the edges of his vision spread inward, and the last thing James heard before consciousness left him was Carol's voice speaking into a radio, calling ahead to her facility, telling them she was bringing in 3 survivors who needed immediate attention. When James woke, he had no idea how much time had passed. He was lying on a bed in a small room with wooden walls and a window that showed late afternoon sunlight streaming through. His leg was wrapped in clean bandages, and an IV line ran into his arm. He was warm, truly warm for the first time in what felt like forever. For a moment, James simply lay there, trying to orient himself, trying to remember how he'd gotten here. Then it all came rushing back. The storm, the horses, the desperate trek through the snow, Carol's rescue, Shadow and Hope. The thought jolted James fully awake, and he tried to sit up despite the protest from his body. Where were they? Were they okay? Had Carol taken them somewhere else? Panic began to rise in his chest until he heard a familiar sound from somewhere beyond the room. A whinny, strong and clear, followed by another. James relaxed back onto the bed, tears of relief streaming down his face. They were here, they were safe, they had all made it. The door to James's room opened and Carol entered carrying a tray with soup and bread. She smiled when she saw he was awake, setting the tray on a small table beside the bed. "Welcome back. You've been out for almost 12 hours. The doctor said your body basically shut down from exhaustion and hypothermia. You're lucky to be alive." She pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down, her weathered face showing genuine concern. "Your leg is infected, but we got antibiotics into you and the doctor thinks you'll keep it. Going to need physical therapy though, and probably surgery eventually to repair some of the damage." James nodded, processing this information, but his mind was elsewhere. Shadow and Hope. Are they okay? His voice was still rough, but stronger than it had been. Carol's smile widened. "Those horses are fine. Better than fine, actually. I've got them in the main barn with food, water, and warm blankets. They've been asking about you too in their way. Every time someone walks past their stall, they look up like they're hoping it's you." James felt emotion welling up in his chest, threatening to overflow. "I need to see them." Carol held up a hand. "You will, I promise. But first you eat, and we talk." She pushed the tray closer, and James realized he was ravenously hungry. As he ate, Carol explained what had happened after she'd brought them in. She'd called the sheriff to report the case of animal abandonment, provided James's description of where he'd found the horses. Deputies had gone to the location and discovered a property owned by a man with a history of neglect charges. The man claimed the horses had been stolen, but the chains and padlocks told a different story. "He's being charged," Carol said with satisfaction. "Won't see those horses again, and hopefully won't be able to own any others." "But that's not all," Carol continued, leaning forward in her chair. "While you were sleeping, I made some calls. Talked to the VA about your situation. Turns out there's a program I didn't know about, housing assistance specifically for homeless veterans. They're sending someone over tomorrow to talk to you, see if we can get you set up with a place to stay." James stared at her, unable to believe what he was hearing. After months of rejection, of being turned away from every shelter and assistance program, suddenly there was help available. It seemed too good to be true. "Why are you doing this?" James asked, his voice breaking. "You don't even know me." Carol was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant. "I had a son, Marine. He came back from Iraq different, struggling. I tried to help, but I didn't understand what he was going through. He ended up on the streets just like you. By the time I found him, it was too late. Overdose." She wiped at her eyes, composing herself. "So now I help where I can. Animals, veterans, anyone who needs it. Maybe I can't bring my son back, but I can make sure others don't fall through the cracks like he did." James didn't know what to say to that, so he reached out and took Carol's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sorry about your son." Carol squeezed back. "Me too. But maybe something good can come from it. Maybe that's why I was out checking properties yesterday. Maybe that's why I found you." She stood up, patting his shoulder. "Now finish that soup and get some rest. Tomorrow we'll get you on your feet and you can see those horses properly." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. The VA representative, a young woman named Sarah, who actually seemed to care, worked with James to get him enrolled in programs he hadn't known existed: emergency housing assistance, medical care coordination, job training for disabled veterans. Doors that had been closed were suddenly opening, and James realized that Carol making those calls, having those connections, knowing the right people to contact, had made all the difference. Sometimes survival wasn't just about personal strength. Sometimes it was about finding the right person willing to help. James's legs slowly improved with proper treatment, and he was able to walk with crutches by the end of the first week. The first place he went was to the main barn to see Shadow and Hope. The horses had been cleaned, fed, and cared for by Carol's staff, and they looked magnificent. But when Shadow saw James approaching, the black horse whinnied loudly and pushed against the stall door. Hope joined in, both animals clearly recognizing the man who had saved them. Carol opened the stall door and James limped inside, immediately engulfed by two large horses pressing close to him, nuzzling his face and hands. He wrapped his arms around Shadow's neck and finally let himself cry, really cry, for the first time since coming home from Afghanistan. All the pain, all the loss, all the months of suffering poured out of him while the horses stood patiently, offering their presence as comfort. When the tears finally stopped, James felt lighter, as if some of the weight he'd been carrying had been lifted. Over the following weeks, James worked with Carol at the rescue, helping care for the animals despite his limited mobility. He discovered he had a natural way with horses, an ability to calm even the most traumatized animals. Carol watched him work and eventually made him an offer. "Stay. Work here. I need someone who understands what these animals have been through, someone with patience and compassion. There's a cabin on the property you can use. It's not much, but it's yours if you want it." James stood in the barn, surrounded by rescued animals with Shadow and Hope in the stall behind him. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose, belonging, Hope. He thought about Jenkins, about Rodriguez and Martinez and Thompson and Williams, about all his brothers who hadn't made it home. They would want this for him. They would want him to live, to find meaning, to help others the way he was being helped. "Yes," James said simply. "I'll stay." Carol smiled, and James returned to the stall where Shadow and Hope waited. He'd been rejected from every shelter, turned away when he needed help most, left to freeze in a blizzard. But 2 chained horses had saved his life by giving him a reason to fight, by showing him that he still had value, that he could still make a difference, and in saving them, he had somehow saved himself. The wounded veteran had finally found his way home.